Clarence Thomas demonstrates that he and Kentanji Brown Jackson are not the same. Hello, good people. It is Todd Shannon, data scientist, social commentator, getter of buckets. And if you are concerned about the transformation, quote unquote, of the children, you know what I'm talking about, then you should be following this case that is now being heard or considered at the Supreme Court in Tennessee. You see, there's this bill in Tennessee, which is, I like to give a shout out to those in Tennessee. Let me see if I can get a round of applause here. That's my air horns. Where's my claps here? Where's my claps? There we go. There we go. I just got to learn how to work my equipment. I would like to give a round of applause to the folks in Tennessee because they have said enough. Enough of the madness. We are not going to trans the kids. And this is a good thing. This is a good thing. And it got so, this became such a big deal that it's being heard before the Supreme Court. And you should be very, 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 very in tune with the decision that will be forthcoming soon. I don't know how long it will take to render the opinion, but they've already heard oral arguments at the Supreme Court. And so I want to talk about this a little bit because Kentanji Brown Jackson is showing exactly why the DEI hire stuff is a bad thing. Yes, you're going to say, oh, Kentanji Brown Jackson is not a DEI hire. She's very qualified. You know what? Kentanji Brown Jackson, you can't tell me that there's a nickel's worth of difference between Kentanji Brown Jackson on the Supreme Court and Kamala Harris as VP. Why? Because he said the same thing about KGB. That might actually be an apt analogy. But KBJ, Kentanji Brown Jackson, I will call her KBJ from here on because it's a hard name to say. Not a nickel's worth of difference between how KBJ became a Supreme Court justice and Kamala Harris because, Joe Biden said he was going to do a black female, and when you do that, that's by definition DEI. And interestingly enough, KBJ couldn't tell you what a woman was when she was in the hearings for her nomination, but now all of a sudden she's got a keen understanding of the difference between male and female, and so she tries to make an argument that I think Justice Clarence Thomas starts to unravel, and he does so in a very understated way. But they show the difference between being black because you're qualified and being black on the Supreme Court because you earned it. So we're going to look at these arguments here and assess their validity. Now, as you know, I am not a lawyer, but I can test the logic of some of these arguments, and I think it's good that they make these publicly available. So let's listen to KBJ make her, in my opinion, quite silly argument about why denying, transing the kids is discrimination on the basis of sex. Let's listen.
I think our position is that if you're in the point where we're treating giving testosterone to a boy with a biological deficiency as the same thing as giving testosterone to a healthy biological girl who wants to transition, then there has to be some threshold inquiry that recognizes the biological differences between those two.
Right, but when you're doing that, you're making a sex-based classification. I mean, the very argument carries with it the characterization that we're trying to identify here. You start by saying it's different to treat a boy who's using this medication for a particular reason from a girl who's, okay, so that's a sex-based classification. Haven't we dealt with step one now? We should be going on to step two.
Now, just so you understand what she's saying here, she's saying that, there's something called the Equal Protection Clause. And there again, I'm not a lawyer, don't hold me to explaining it perfectly, but effectively, the Equal Protection Clause basically says you cannot discriminate on the basis of these immutable characteristics or whatever characteristics they classify in this clause. And she's saying, well, sex is a protected class, so you cannot discriminate on the basis of sex. And so you're saying that because girls can't receive certain treatments on the basis of sex, and boys can't receive certain treatment on the basis of sex, then you're discriminating on the basis of sex. But her argument is flawed here because what the person who's arguing in favor of SB1 is that he's saying it's not discrimination on the basis of sex. It's discrimination based on the purpose of the drug. Or not discrimination. It makes a distinction. Well, discrimination and distinction are, synonyms, okay? So he's trying to make that case, and he's trying to say there is a difference between boys and girls, and so the purpose of these drugs is what is at issue here. Let's listen.
Intermediate scrutiny applies by the terms of what you're arguing.
I don't think that we agree that we've checked the box at step one because there is no medical treatment that boys can receive that girls cannot. So we disagree with the notion.
Didn't we already dispose of that kind of reasoning with our equal protection cases that looked at things like interracial marriage, where we said even though it applies to both, it's still making a racial classification? Even though whites can't marry non-whites and non-whites can't marry whites in the statute, right? So both are equally disadvantaged. We said that's not an argument for why you shouldn't have a heightened scrutiny or why the statute is not making a race-based classification.
And that's not the argument that we're making.
Okay, so what is
we
your
are not
argument?
arguing that you can discriminate and draw lines so long as you do so both against boys and against girls. We're arguing there is no sex-based line. If you're a boy and you go in to get puberty blockers, you can get the puberty blockers if you're going to use them for precocious puberty. You cannot get the puberty blockers if you're going to use them to transition. That is not a sex-based line. That is a purpose-based line.
So you see where he clarifies his argument. KBJ apparently tries to put an argument in his mouth that he wasn't making. He politely corrects her, but she continues to press this. If you listen to the these arguments, and it's a little more than 2 hours of content, so it's a lot of content there. But KBJ is quite vocal. She keeps trying to press this thing, insisting or suggesting that this is some violation of the Equal Protective Clause because it is discrimination on the basis of race. And he's saying, no, there isn't. And this is where, I'll bring you in close, this is where I get a little frustrated with some of these processes because it's ridiculous to me that we are having to say out loud, hey, well, there is a difference between boys and girls. And I think that that's obvious, right? But I think what isn't, and there again, I'm not a legal expert, but I can follow the logic pretty well. I think if what KBJ is suggesting is true, then what would happen is a biological female, I don't even know why I have to append biological to it. There's only one kind of female. If she went to a physician and said, I would like to have a vasectomy, and then the doctor refused her that treatment on the basis of sex, then it would seem to me that she would be able to sue that physician because of discrimination. And then she could say, well, why are you suing? She said, well, I don't want to have any more children, so I want to have a vasectomy. And then the doctor would say, yeah, but I can't give you I can't give you a vasectomy. You're not a male. That's a male treatment. Now, I could give you a hysterectomy, then that would be different. And so now the purpose now comes into view. But there isn't any reason why I don't think that logic wouldn't apply, that a biological male could go and ask for a hysterectomy, and if the doctor refused, saying, we can't, that's not even possible, then they could say, well, you're discriminating on the basis of sex. And this next part of the argument kind of gets into this, because I think they start to, this becomes argumentum ad absurdum, okay? It becomes an absurd argument because these people are just insistent upon, making arguments that don't make any sense. But let's listen to this next part here.
I think the point I was getting at with respect to remedies is normally in equal protection cases, there's a difference between one group and another. In Bourne, it would be that the women could buy alcohol, but the male students could not. And what would that be in this case?
So 2 points, Your Honor. I think that what the birth males can do that birth females cannot do is receive medical treatment to live and identify as boys, and what birth females can do that birth males can't do is receive medical treatment to live and identify as girls. That's
okay, let's change. What if, would you make the same argument if we were only talking about puberty blockers?
If it was puberty blockers, I would point to John Doe, who is receiving puberty blockers. The purpose of receiving puberty blockers for John Doe is so that in the future he can undergo a typical male puberty.
No, I'm talking about from an equal protection standpoint, the difference in treatment. Normally in these cases, one group receives something that the other group does not. And I'm trying to discern that in this case.
And so what I would say to Justice Thomas is that a birth sex male can receive puberty blockers to undergo a typical male puberty, and a birth sex female cannot.
All right. So you see Justice Thomas, there again, Justice Thomas says to KBJ and the rest of them, we are not the same. He is putting his finger exactly on the pulse of the problem. Because first of all, he says, well, in the equal protection cases, one group receives something that the other group does not. So what are you saying one group is receiving that the other one does not? There is no issue with equal protection, because first of all, neither group is really receiving the thing that you're saying that they should be receiving. But secondarily, he's saying there is a real difference. And I think he'll get into this a little bit later, but he's basically saying you are arguing that this is a sex-based discrimination case, but what's the remedy? How does this remedy play out? And in particularly with puberty blockers, it applies to both of them equally, because they're saying you cannot unnaturally suppress a male or female's puberty if they are underage. And obviously, the only people who go through puberty are those who are minors, right? So he basically says no one's being treated differently here. So he's just putting his thumb on the pulse of that particular thing. But I want to highlight something that this person arguing to Trans the Kids says. She says, well, a boy might get puberty blockers because if he has precocious puberty, that's early onset puberty. This is where kids start to go through puberty at like 7, for boys, like maybe 7 years old or something like that. And apparently what happens is if that happens, their growth ends up being stunted. And so they might give them puberty blockers to delay the puberty, but then later on, they would allow it to go on. And the reason why is because, if they don't do that, the boy might not reach a typical height. Now, she's using the word typical. So she's saying, well, a boy wants to go through a typical male puberty, but if a girl identifies as a boy and she wants to go through typical male puberty, just think about that. A girl going through typical male puberty. This is the argument ad absurdum that I was talking about. It isn't possible for a female to go through a male puberty at all, much less a, quote, typical male puberty. There's nothing typical about an unnatural, forced medical process that injects hormones into the body that are not native to that person's sex. There's nothing typical about that. And I thought it was interesting that, I think that Justice Thomas was focusing on something very different, but he didn't point that out. But I thought that was interesting. But I want to go to this last part here, because this is Justice Thomas there again. He's on it. Let's hear these last arguments here.
Well, is there no difference if a girl takes testosterone or if a boy takes testosterone?
So the district court specifically considered this question in detail and found that with respect to the risks that the state had identified, it was not substantiated that there would be unique risks associated with the cross-sex use of the hormone.
Is there no physiological difference?
Certainly, I understand that there are biological differences between males and females, but when it came to the specific risk factors that the state was focused on, what the district court found is that many of those risk factors would exist regardless of the birth sex of who is taking those medications.
I'm more interested in whether or not there is a difference in testosterone and its reaction in a male as opposed to a female, and vice versa for estrogen.
So if you take hormones, they will prompt the development of secondary sex characteristics in whether you're a male or a female. If you take testosterone, you might develop a deeper voice register. You might have facial hair growth. And in fact, that's one of the intended effects of these treatments, because that can be critical to helping manage gender dysphoria that transgender adolescents would otherwise experience.
So that's an interesting answer to Justice Thomas's question, because it doesn't address his question. Is there a difference?
Well, Your Honor, if you take hormones, there are problems secondary sex characteristics.
Duh, we know that. We know that it will prompt secondary sex characteristics. The question is testosterone different in a woman's body? Does it have a different effect in a woman's body than it does in a male's? And vice versa. Does estrogen have a different impact in a male's body than it does in a female? And by the way, talking about these risk factors that are no different whether you're a male and female, that isn't true. That isn't true. But I think what Justice Thomas really showed and what he demonstrated is not only a solid grasp of the law, but just plain old common sense. Because this goes back to the point that I was making earlier, which is that if what they're saying is true, then there's no reason why a woman can't go to the doctor and say, I'd like to have a vasectomy. Or a man wouldn't be able to go to the doctor and say, I'd like to have a hysterectomy. There is a difference between male and female, and the impact of that is going to be felt in the way you deal with how they are treated. And so I actually think this is one of my primary points in this video is that what we see in the law is in the world, generally speaking, we see differential treatment all the time. And what the law is trying to tease out, and I think the intent of the law, and again, I'm not a lawyer, but this just seems to be logically true, is that we have different treatment of different classes of people all the time. The question becomes, are those treatments arbitrary? Are they arbitrary? Are they just simply imposing on the people a difference when there fundamentally is no difference? That's what the law is designed to snuff out. Arbitrary discrimination. When an employer decides who they want to hire, they discriminate all the time. What they want is people who are competent, who have a certain skill set, people who they think will perform at the highest level. That necessarily means that you will discriminate one from another. And the law allows that. What they do not allow for is arbitrary discrimination, where you're this height, or you are this weight, or you are this sex, when that characteristic has no bearing on the performance of their duties. Now, even in sports, for example, discrimination on the basis of height is actually a real thing, because in the sports context, particularly basketball, for example, height is not an arbitrary characteristic. It actually is a characteristic that has a significant bearing, typically on how well you can perform. But even in that situation, you couldn't just say, an employer couldn't just say, or a professional basketball team couldn't just say, well, we don't want you to be on our basketball team because you're 5'11", right? They would have to say, well, the fact that you're 5'11" materially impacts your performance, and because of that, we don't want you. We don't think you're good enough. So what Kentanji Brown Jackson and other, I think, clearly incorrect people are arguing is that in this particular case, these classifications are arbitrarily different. They're treating the males and the females different arbitrarily. And that's not true. And what Clarence Thomas is putting his finger on the pulse is that These are not arbitrary. These are actually meaningful differences because testosterone does not have the same effect on a female that it does on a male, and neither does estrogen have the same impact on a male as it does on a female. And so we shouldn't be saying this is an equal protection situation because they are not the same. And for that matter, Clarence Thomas and KBJ are not the same. But I'd like to know what you think. Have you followed this case? This to me is very important. Leave me your comments in the comment section, particularly if you study law. And if I miss anything, I'd like to know if I'm incorrect on anything. Happy to have that feedback. And if you're your first time at this channel, I appreciate you coming by. Please like, share, and subscribe. Until next time, friends, God bless you.